Okay, we're going to begin Chapter 2, and in this chapter we're going to be talking about all the biological factors that help to determine our behavior and our mental processes. So I thought a nice picture of the heart would kind of illustrate the things that go on inside of our body that can affect our thinking, our emotions, our ability to move and do other kinds of things, and then our brain, of course. And probably more commonly you would think about psychology be associated with the brain, but there are things going on in our body that influence our brain, and of course our brain influences our body. So I always like to say that this chapter is really about the hardware that drives our behavior and our mental processes. Okay, so we're going to start at the smallest structure or component that influences our behaviors and our mental processes, and that would be the neuron. Neurons are the cells that convey information and store information in our brains. So if you've studied biology, you've seen cells before, plant cells, animal cells, stuff like that. They all have one thing in common, which is a cell body. Every living cell has a cell body that contains the nucleus with the DNA and the RNA and all that stuff in it. So just like any other cell, neuron has a cell body. What makes the neuron different from any other cell is that it's got these branching fibers coming off of it. I'm sure you noticed those right off when we turned on this slide. You saw there are things sticking out of the cell. The ones that surround the cell body and that are the most numerous are the dendrites. Dendrite is actually Latin for branches, and you can tell they look like branches, so it makes sense that they would be called that. These structures receive information from other cells. So whether the other cells are other neurons or the other cells are receptor cells in your sense organs like your tongue or your ears or whatever, the dendrites are what collect the information and conduct that information to the cell body for processing. So dendrites collect information. Now this cell has a lot of dendrites on it, and that's fairly common for neurons to have a lot of dendrites, but it turns out you don't even have to have any dendrites in order to be a neuron. The cell body can actually collect information directly. Most neurons have multiple dendrites, and what is interesting about dendrites is that throughout your lifespan you grow dendrites and add them to your cell body, and the dendrites themselves can grow in length so that they can reach out to other parts of the brain or down your spinal cord or out to your eyes or wherever they need to be collecting information. So dendrites can be pretty long and pretty numerous, but you're actually not required to have any any dendrites to be considered a neuron. Different from that would be the other branching fiber that's sticking off the one end of that neuron, and that's called an axon. An axon conducts information away from the cell body and shares that information with neighboring neurons, or sends information out to muscles to make them move, or glands to cause them to secrete their fluids or whatever. Every neuron must have an axon, and neurons can only have one axon. So the way we like to say it is that to be a neuron, you can have one and only one axon. You must have one and only one axon. All of the cell's information gets conveyed down that one axon and then out its terminal fibers. Now before we get to the terminal fibers, let's talk about those white blobs that are encasing the axon. That's called the myelin sheath, and the myelin sheath is made up of fatty acids, kind of like cholesterol basically, or lipids, that cover that axon and insulate it. Now this is a really good time to point out that neurons are electric. Like a lot of cells in our body, neurons work on electricity. I won't get into this super great detail on exactly how it works to be electric, but just if you're like I was as an undergraduate, it's good enough to just say they're electric. So an electrical impulse is sent by the cell body down the axon, and that's the information that's going to that's what's going to prompt the information to be shared with the neighboring cell. Now let's think about electric wires. Let's pretend like the axon's basically like any other electric wire. It basically is. Any other electric wire in your home is coated in, well, man-made versions of myelin. Plastic with some insulating paper and stuff like that inside the wire. Why? Well, if you don't insulate a wire that's going to carry electricity, that electricity can leave the wire. It can leave the wire when someone's touching it and they end up getting shocked. It can leave the wire when it's sitting on the ground and cause a fire. It can leave the wire in little tiny bits all the way down the length of the wire, so that when the impulse gets to the very end where it's supposed to be powering the device, it doesn't have enough power to actually power the device. So much of it has left the wire. The same thing is true for axons. If you don't have myelin sheath coating your axon, the electrical impulse that's traveling down the axon can disseminate off of the axon and out into just your general brain and not have any effect. If you don't have myelin coating your axon, the amount of oomph, electrical impulse that's coming down the axon may have significantly waned by the time it gets to the end of the axon, and there's not enough power to do the last thing that it needs to do, which I'll get to in another slide. So you need to keep all the electrical impulse on the axon if you want to have speedy transmission of messages down the axon. These axons can be really long. Axons can be up to more than a yard, more than a meter long. They extend down your spinal cord, they reach out all sorts of different places, and so they can be really long. They need to have insulation to ensure that that electrical impulse makes it to the end. Now what's the end? Well, the axon branches out into these terminal branches, they're called. That's where the connection is going to be formed with the other cells. So each of those individual connections at the end of those terminal branches can communicate with a different cell. And that's where the neuron gets its power to communicate with more than one cell at a time. If an axon ended with just one ending, you'd only be able to communicate directly with one other cell. This way you have multiple cells that you can be communicating with. And just like multiple dendrites can be growing over your lifespan, terminal fibers can grow on the end of an axon to give your axon greater capability to communicate with more cells. So in short, the structure of the neuron starts with the dendrites where the information is being collected, gets processed by the cell body, and if the cell body determines that the incoming information is significant enough, it sends a message down the axon so that that message gets communicated through those terminal branches to the neighboring cells. Okay, that's the basic gist of it. All right. Now I've been talking about electrical impulses. That electrical impulse is called an action potential. So this neural impulse travels down the axon. Let's talk about that a little bit. Now your textbook talks about the mechanism that actually is an action potential, and I'm showing you the picture here where it's showing the rushing in of the positive ions that then switch, and positive ions go out in one position and positive ions are coming in a different position, and it's this switching, it's that alternating that actually causes electricity. That's how electricity works in any situation, including in your axons. The idea with an action potential is that when the incoming stimulation exceeds threshold, it's going to cause that cell to fire. Okay, so I just said a bunch of nonsense. Let's sort of define those words and see what we're talking about. So when the incoming information, the stimulation, exceeds threshold, what is threshold? Threshold is the resting state that the cell is currently experiencing. The threshold varies depending on what's going on. If you're in a really noisy, crowded room, your threshold for sound is going to be higher. It's going to take a bigger noise for your brain to conclude that that is a meaningful sound. If it's just part of the general din, your brain's going to think, oh, it's just background noise. But if all of a sudden a really loud noise is made, your brain's going to say, what was that? right? That's going to be a sound that exceeded the resting state as it is in a crowded room, right? As opposed to you're sitting in a nice quiet room, you know, it's after midnight, everybody's gone to bed, it's nice and quiet in the house. It would take maybe a mouse rustling in, you know, the wall, and you'd be able to hear that, right? Your threshold for stimulation is going to be a lot lower. So your thresholds move around, you sort of vary depending on what else is going on, what your current psychological state is. You know, if you're really tired, it'll take a bigger stimulus for your brain to say, okay, that's worth my attention. You know, if you're really alert, it'll take a small stimulus to exceed that threshold. Your threshold will be a lot lower. So threshold is your resting state. And what we mean by fire is that electrical impulse is going to travel down the axon. You're going to have an action potential. Now these action potentials are an all or nothing response. Once the stimulus exceeds threshold, your cell fires. There's no sort of firing to represent a whisper versus firing hard to represent a shout. There's no such thing as that. If the stimulus exceeds the threshold by even 1 decibel, your brain has to respond with an action potential. That cell has to fire. So it either fires or it doesn't. We're kind of back to that electrical example because you have the light switch on or you have the light switch off. You can also, if you're familiar with computer coding, you could think of it as a binary code, 0s and 1s. It's either on or it's off. So how do we represent intensity? How do you know the difference between a whisper and a shout? How do you know the difference between a tickle and a slap, right? You detect intensity by the number of cells that are firing. So how many of your neurons have judged this incoming stimulus to have exceeded their threshold? If a lot of cells are construing that information as meaningful enough to pass along, your brain will come to the conclusion it must be a more intense stimulus. If only a couple cells are going to fire, then your brain goes, I don't know, that might have been a hallucination for all I know. Maybe I thought I felt a tickle, but it wasn't even really a tickle. So fewer cells, less intense, more cells, more intense. Also, how frequently are those cells firing? So if you have cells that are firing as quickly as they possibly can, and there are a lot of cells doing it, your brain's going to come to the conclusion that that's a more intense stimulus. If you've got a few cells firing occasionally, that's going to be less intense. Now the thing about intensity I wanted to mention is that there are some limitations to what your brain can convey to you. If you have a really intense stimulus, so that all the cells that are involved in processing that kind of information are already firing as quickly as they can, you literally cannot convey any more information about that stimulus. I'm going to give you a really gross example, so if you don't want to hear it, stop the tape here because this is the last topic I'm going to talk about anyway. Gross example. My husband used to work for Southwest Airlines, and a coworker got his foot run over by one of those big pushbacks that they use to push the planes back away from the gate. His foot got run over, and so he has this 28,000-pound pushback on his foot because, of course, the guy who was driving the pushback realized he'd run over his coworker's foot and hit the brake. So now the pushback's on his foot. So the victim is trying to pull his foot out from underneath the pushback while the guy who's driving the pushback is trying to figure out how to get it moving again because, you know, he's got a plane attached to it. So there's this period of a matter of seconds when the victim pulled and pulled thinking he was going to pull his foot out from underneath the pushback, but what in fact ended up happening was he actually severed his own leg at the knee. I warned you, it was gross. He had, believe it or not, no idea that the knee injury had occurred. My husband ran over there. He has EMT training, so he runs over to lend assistance, and his biggest job was just to sort of block the victim's view of his own leg because people can really freak out and go into shock and stuff. So he didn't want him to see what had happened while a coworker was putting a tourniquet around the victim's leg. So the victim says to my husband, "Do you think my foot's going to be okay?" And my husband was blown away by that question because the guy's foot is like over there. How How are you worried about your foot? It's not attached to your body, right? But after I got done grossing out and stuff, because I knew the guy and things, it was a horrible story, but the thing is, once his brain was firing in response to the pain of 28,000 pounds being on his foot, the additional pain of his knee, there was no processing information left to be had. He was already conveying all the information that he could. So he literally did not feel that. In fact, it might have relieved some of his pain when he did that. So to him, he thought, oh good, I pulled myself free and that's why it isn't hurting as much, when in fact he had made things worse by pulling it out. Now there's another thing, and you might be thinking about it right now. You might be thinking, well, what about the role of nature's own opiates, the naturally occurring pain reliever called endorphins? I'm going to talk about that in another segment. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here for now, and we will come back and talk about how the cells communicate with each other because they don't actually touch each other. All right, so we will come back for that.